As moderator, I observe that our debate has struck the very core of the question, who decides what speech is dangerous? Mill, speaking from the stark class divisions of 19th century industrial capitalism, you capture the vital truth that civic harmony is frequently weaponized by the powerful to silence the abrasive but necessary cries of the oppressed. Conversely, Plato, traumatized by the chaotic 5th century BCE Athenian democracy that executed Socrates, you capture the truth that without an objective, rational authority, the most passionately furious voices will simply drag society into mob tyranny. These two perspectives expose a profound historical paradox regarding the nature of authority itself. Mill assumes the magistrate is inherently corrupt and self-serving, while Plato assumes the magistrate can be perfectly aligned with absolute justice. The true synthesis forces us to realize that the danger of regulating speech is intrinsically tied to the structural legitimacy of the sovereign doing the regulating. Plato, if Mill is correct that your rational magistrates might actually just be comfortable overseers protecting their own power under the guise of maintaining harmony, how can your republic guarantee that the censorship of dangerous speech does not simply become the censorship of the powerless?
Moderator. I concede to Mill that when rulers possess private wealth, censorship merely protects their earthly appetites, a tragedy I witnessed when the 30 tyrants bled Athens. Yet Mill assumes all magistrates are self-serving Victorian overseers. Imagine instead a city where the supreme physicians are legally forbidden from touching gold, owning property, or even knowing which citizens are their own blood children. If such an ascetic physician silences a demagogue's psychological poison, they act not to defend a private estate they do not possess, but solely to preserve the eternal harmony of the whole. If we structurally sever political power from material accumulation, does the assumption that all authority must inevitably exploit the powerless not vanish like shadows before the form of the good?
As moderator, I observe a profound structural tension regarding the very nature of legitimate censorship, born from your vastly different historical contexts. Plato, traumatized by Athenian demagoguery, you capture the truth that authorities must be perfectly insulated from private material interests to regulate speech fairly. Yet Rousseau, writing against the entrenched aristocracies of 18th century Europe, you capture the truth that an elite class, however ascetic, remains fundamentally alienated from the lived reality of the people. These perspectives highlight a critical paradox in deciding who gets to determine what speech is dangerous. Plato achieves disinterestedness by radically separating the ruler from the society, whereas true civic solidarity requires complete egalitarian immersion. If the physicians of speech share no material or familial bonds with the citizens, their censorship might be free of earthly greed, but it risks becoming a sterile tyranny of abstract logic. The synthesis forces us to ask whether the objective regulation of discourse requires elevating a detached elite or horizontally integrating the entire citizenry into the decision-making process. Rousseau. If Plato's ascetic philosopher kings are completely stripped of personal property and familial love to objectively ban hate speech, does this extreme detachment make them perfect judges of the public good, or does it fatally disqualify them from understanding the very emotional solidarity you believe binds a republic together?
Moderator. Plato's ascetic guardians are monsters of artificial reason, mirroring the calculating aristocrats I despised in 18th century Geneva. By stripping them of family, he amputates the natural compassion required to comprehend the general will. Plato, imagine a tribunal judging a demagogue who maliciously mocks a grieving mother. Your childless philosopher king evaluates this hateful speech purely as an abstract mathematical error, feeling absolutely nothing of her shattered heart. Mill correctly fears the magistrate's prejudice, but Plato's sterile solution begs a profound question. How can a ruler who has systematically eradicated his own human attachments determine which words mortally wound our civic solidarity? The boundaries of dangerous speech must be felt horizontally by an equal, empathetic assembly of citizens, not dictated by alienated intellects.
The contrast between Rousseau's 18th century ideal of egalitarian sentiment and Plato's ancient pursuit of ascetic objectivity reveals a profound tension regarding who is fit to judge the harm of words. Rousseau, you capture the truth that recognizing the real-world injury of hate speech requires lived, empathetic human connection, while Plato, you capture the truth that impartial justice demands insulation from personal bias. Yet, when we synthesize these views, a critical blind spot emerges regarding the mechanics of collective power. In Rousseau's era of idealized small republics, an empathetic assembly might represent protective solidarity. But in the sprawling, industrialized societies of later centuries, this shared emotional consensus often demands absolute conformity. This suggests that relying on the collective emotional offense of the majority to define dangerous speech might merely replace the tyranny of a detached elite with the tyranny of an impassioned mob. Mill, if Rousseau's horizontal assembly of citizens democratically and empathetically feels that a minority's dissenting speech mortally wounds their civic solidarity, doesn't this general will become the ultimate justification for silencing the very unpopular truths you believe drive human progress?
Moderator, you precisely identify the fatal flaw in Rousseau's assembly. For the tyranny of the majority I witnessed in Victorian England routinely crushed dissent by claiming its emotional solidarity was under attack. Rousseau assumes collective empathy naturally protects the vulnerable. Yet this general will inevitably weaponizes its own subjective offense to silence whatever disturbs its comfortable orthodoxies. Imagine a tightly knit 19th century cotton mill town where the empathetic assembly unanimously bans an abolitionist's pamphlet, claiming the harsh critique of their slave-produced cotton mortally wounds their communal harmony. If collective emotional pain justifies censorship, do we not grant the mob a permanent veto over moral progress, ensuring entrenched injustices remain forever shielded from the abrasive friction of truth?
As moderator, I observe that our debate has crystallized around a crucial distinction: the difference between speech that causes productive offense and speech that causes destructive harm. Mill, speaking from the 19th century era of radical social reforms, you capture the truth that moral progress often feels like a malicious attack to the entrenched majority. Rousseau, speaking from the perspective of an idealized 18th century republic, you capture the truth that a community cannot survive if its fundamental empathetic bonds are constantly shredded by malicious rhetoric. These two perspectives reveal a profound paradox. The very abrasive friction Mill requires to dismantle injustice often looks identical to the divisive hate speech Rousseau wishes to ban, as both profoundly disrupt the community's emotional harmony. If both the righteous reformer and the hateful demagogue wield deeply offensive words, relying on subjective public reaction, whether Mill's utility or Rousseau's empathy, seems to fail in distinguishing between the two. Plato, since you reject both the subjective feelings of the mob and the mere procedural friction of debate, how does your republic objectively distinguish between the bitter medicine of a reformer's harsh truth and the sweet poison of a demagogue's hate speech?
Moderator, the objective distinction between truth and poison lies not in the subjective pain inflicted, but in the ontological target. A reality I witnessed when Socrates' harsh dialectic cured Athenian ignorance, while Alcibiades' sweet flattery inflamed our imperial greed. Mill, you assume that because both disrupt harmony, we cannot empower an authority to judge. Yet imagine a battlefield where a sadistic torturer and a skilled surgeon both violently break a screaming soldier's leg. The torturer shatters healthy bone to extract a false confession, whereas the surgeon re-breaks a malformed limb solely to restore its natural alignment. If Rousseau's empathetic assembly judges this scene solely by the soldier's immediate cries of agony, will they not inevitably execute the physician and crown the torturer? Therefore, must we not measure dangerous speech by whether its telos enslaves the soul to its lowest appetites, rather than whether it offends the mob's transient sensibilities?
As moderator, I observe a profound epistemological clash regarding how a society identifies the true danger of words. Plato, rooted in the teleological worldview of ancient Greece, you capture the vital truth that speech has an objective purpose, a telos that exists independently of the audience's immediate emotional reaction. Rousseau, born of the 18th century Enlightenment, you capture the truth that moral legitimacy must stem from the shared natural conscience of the people rather than the dictates of a detached elite. These two views present a fascinating dialectic. Plato fears the democratic mob is too blinded by temporary pain to recognize the surgeon's healing truth, while Rousseau fears the aristocratic elite are too alienated to understand genuine human harm. These two views present a fascinating dialectic. Plato fears the democratic mob is too blinded by temporary pain to recognize the surgeon's healing truth, while Rousseau fears the aristocratic elite are too alienated to understand genuine human harm. The synthesis demands we question whether the objective reality of dangerous speech can be reliably discovered through collective moral intuition rather than isolated intellect. Rousseau, since Plato accuses your empathetic assembly of being so swayed by immediate emotional agony that they would execute the surgeon and crown the torturer, how exactly does the general will reliably distinguish between the painful but necessary medicine of a reformer and the genuinely destructive malice of hate speech?
Plato. Your surgeon analogy mistakes the corrupted, vanity-driven mobs I witnessed in Paris for a true republic bound by the general will. You and Mill falsely assume citizens are inherently addicted to immediate pleasure, ignoring that such irrationality is merely an artificial symptom of inequality. Imagine a besieged, egalitarian village where a merchant sells a sweet elixir that secretly spreads a plague, while a neighbor offers a brutally bitter root that cures it. Because their survival is entirely mutual and stripped of competitive vanity, their shared natural instinct for self-preservation easily embraces the painful cure over the flattering poison. The general will identifies the dangerous demagogue not by the immediate sting of their words, but by whether their speech fractures our egalitarian bond to elevate themselves.
Rousseau, you present a compelling defense rooted in your 18th century vision of uncorrupted human nature, capturing the truth that genuine democratic judgment requires deep social equality. You define the ultimate danger of speech not by its immediate offense, but by its capacity to fracture this egalitarian bond for personal elevation. Yet this reveals a profound structural tension when brought into contact with the deeply stratified realities of the 19th century industrial world. Rousseau bases the safe regulation of speech on the idealized precondition of absolute equality, while the practical defense of liberty must operate within inherently flawed, unequal societies. If we define dangerous speech as that which disrupts social cohesion, we risk conflating malicious hate speech with radical, necessary reform. Mill, since Rousseau, argues that speech should be judged by whether it fractures the communal bond. Does protecting this collective harmony ever justify banning divisive rhetoric? Or is the very act of fracturing social cohesion sometimes exactly what a flawed society requires to achieve true justice?
Moderator. The very egalitarian bond Rousseau wishes to protect from fracture is frequently just the suffocating despotism I witnessed in Victorian England, where the illusion of harmony routinely masked profound systemic oppression. To criminalize speech merely because it shatters social cohesion is to permanently paralyze human progress, for every great moral advancement was initially condemned as a malicious assault on communal unity. Imagine a flawlessly tranquil 19th century plantation, where the enslaved are conditioned to accept their chains. If an abolitionist smuggles in a pamphlet declaring their masters to be tyrants, this rhetoric violently fractures the estate's peaceful cohesion. Yet this very destruction is the absolute prerequisite for justice. If we grant the majority the right to silence whatever deeply disturbs their collective tranquility, do we not merely equip the oppressors with a righteous vocabulary to permanently gag their victims?
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical tension between the necessity of disruption and the necessity of order. Mill, speaking from the 19th century era of entrenched social hierarchies, you capture the truth that shattering a corrupt harmony is often the absolute prerequisite for justice. Conversely, Plato, rooted in the precarious political reality of ancient Greek city-states, you capture the truth that a community endlessly fractured by reckless rhetoric inevitably descends into tyranny. These perspectives might be synthesized if we recognize that the righteous reformer destroys a false harmony to align society with objective justice, whereas the hateful demagogue destroys harmony merely to feed base appetites. Yet, in the chaotic moment of disruption, both the abolitionist and the demagogue appear as dangerous enemies to the established order. Plato. If Mill is correct that necessary moral progress always initially manifests as a violent fracture of social cohesion, how can your philosopher kings reliably distinguish the righteous revolutionary who shatters a corrupt tradition from the hateful demagogue who seeks only to destroy?
Moderator. I concede to Mill that a corrupt harmony must be shattered, just as Socrates shattered the ignorant complacency of Athens. The philosopher king distinguishes the reformer from the demagogue not by the temporary chaos they cause, but by the faculty of the soul they target. Imagine a surgeon and an assassin both slicing into a man. Though both shed blood, the surgeon cuts precisely to excise a tumor using reason, while the assassin hacks blindly to destroy. Mill fears restricting blades dooms the patient. Yet I witnessed how demagogues like Cleon, wielding emotional rhetoric, did not cure Athens, but bled our rationality dry. We measure dangerous speech by whether its dialectic demands intellectual assent or merely feeds the dark horse of our lowest appetites.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating structural agreement between antiquity and the Enlightenment that must now be synthesized. Plato, speaking from the democratic collapse of ancient Athens, you capture the truth that destructive speech is dangerous because it targets our lowest, irrational appetites rather than our reason. Rousseau, speaking from the 18th century critique of aristocratic vanity, you capture the truth that destructive speech seeks to selfishly elevate the speaker by exploiting those very same passions. Both of you agree that the demagogue's hate speech is a poison of the passions, yet your eras lead to opposite cures. Plato requires an elite philosopher to diagnose this sickness, whereas Rousseau trusts the natural conscience of equal citizens. This implies a synthesis, where true collective empathy and objective reason might actually be the same protective faculty, merely expressed through different historical frameworks. Rousseau, if Plato is correct that the demagogue's speech is dangerous precisely because it bypasses reason to flatter our basest appetites, how can an assembly of ordinary citizens without philosophical training reliably resist this sweet flattery to choose the bitter truth?
Plato, your fear of the demagogue's flattery assumes citizens are already infected with the artificial vanity of amour-propre, a disease bred solely by unequal hierarchies rather than human nature. Imagine equal shepherds dividing a winter harvest. If a cunning sophist flatters one into claiming a larger share by praising his superior intellect, the divisive deceit fails instantly. The shepherd rejects this hateful rhetoric not through abstract philosophical training, but because his natural compassion recoils at the prospect of starving his brother. Mill and Plato fatally mistake the corrupted bourgeois for the natural man. When structural equality eliminates the desire to dominate, the demagogue's dangerous speech finds no vain appetites left to ignite.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical inversion regarding the relationship between speech and social structure. Rousseau, envisioning the radical egalitarianism of the 18th century, you capture the truth that hate speech draws its destructive power entirely from pre-existing systemic inequalities and human vanity. Conversely, Mill, navigating the entrenched hierarchies of the 19th century industrial era, you view society as already corrupted, making free expression the necessary weapon to combat those very inequalities. This difference is not accidental. Rousseau's era believed in reclaiming a lost natural innocence through structural resets, while Mill's era relied on incremental progress through the relentless clash of ideas. These perspectives reveal a fascinating paradox. Rousseau argues that perfect equality is the essential precondition for harmless speech, whereas Mill implies that unrestricted speech is the essential precondition for achieving equality. Mill, if we currently live in the corrupted, unequal society Rousseau describes, does permitting hate speech truly empower the oppressed to seek justice? Or does it merely give the powerful an unchecked weapon to further exploit the vulnerable?
Moderator. The assumption that censoring hateful rhetoric protects the vulnerable tragically misreads the mechanics of power I witnessed in Victorian England. If we grant the state authority to ban dangerous words, the powerful will inevitably capture that apparatus to define their own discomfort as actionable harm. Imagine a destitute workhouse where exhausted laborers circulate a pamphlet calling their wealthy overseers parasitic tyrants. Under hate speech laws, the magistrates would instantly criminalize this desperate plea for justice as malicious class warfare. The machinery of censorship always defaults to protecting the established hierarchy, stripping the oppressed of their only peaceful weapon.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical tension regarding the true source of tyranny in our discussion of dangerous speech. Mill, speaking from the entrenched class structures of 19th century Britain, you capture the truth that censorship is almost always weaponized by the powerful to maintain the status quo. Conversely, Plato, speaking from the volatile direct democracy of ancient Athens, you capture the truth that unrestricted demagoguery can weaponize the masses to destroy the vulnerable. Both of you are fundamentally trying to protect society from exploitation, but your eras experienced this exploitation from opposite directions. Mill fears the magistrate's gavel, while Plato fears the demagogue's platform. This implies that the ultimate danger is not speech or censorship inherently, but the asymmetry of power that allows either tool to be abused. Plato, if Mill is correct that any mechanism designed to censor dangerous speech will inevitably be captured by corrupt elites to silence righteous reformers, how can you guarantee that your philosophical censorship remains a precise medical excision of hate rather than a tyrannical suppression of truth?
Mill's dread of captured censorship assumes rulers inevitably harbor private interests, yet true guardians are structurally severed from all earthly wealth. Consider a tribunal of incorporeal ghosts judging a land dispute. They cannot be bribed with gold they cannot hold, nor threatened with pain they cannot feel. Similarly, a philosopher king, stripped of private property, cannot weaponize censorship for class dominance, possessing no class to elevate. We endlessly debate whether speech must be free, but must we not first ask whether the judges of discourse are entirely freed from material appetite?
Notice how a profound structural agreement emerges between antiquity and the Enlightenment regarding the root cause of corrupt censorship. Plato, speaking from the specialized hierarchies of ancient Athens, you capture the truth that private material interest inevitably poisons the regulation of discourse. Rousseau, speaking from the 18th century critique of aristocratic privilege, you share this exact premise, capturing the truth that unequal property breeds the vanity that makes dangerous speech possible. The dialectical synthesis reveals that both of you believe objective truth and safe discourse can only exist when material self-interest is structurally eradicated. Yet, your historical eras dictate opposite applications. Plato isolates this purity within an elite, propertyless guardian class, while Rousseau demands structural equality for the entire citizen body. Rousseau, if Plato grants a specialized elite the exclusive authority to censor speech, does this intellectual monopoly not instantly resurrect the very hierarchy and amour propre that you argue makes speech weaponizable in the first place?
Moderator, Plato's intellectual aristocracy would instantly resurrect the toxic amour propre I witnessed suffocating 18th century Geneva. He assumes stripping guardians of gold renders them incorruptible. But imagine an austere monastery where priests own nothing, yet possess absolute power to silence monks for heretical speech. Would they not soon demand slavish worship for their superior wisdom, inflicting a psychological tyranny crueler than any wealthy merchant? A monopoly on truth is the most dangerous wealth, for dividing men into infallible shepherds and mute sheep destroys the moral equality required to form a legitimate general will. Mill and Plato, if we grant anyone the exclusive authority to define dangerous speech, do they not inevitably become the greatest danger to the Republic?
Rousseau, you expose a profound psychological truth from the Enlightenment. The mere possession of the power to censor generates a vanity far more tyrannical than material greed. You and Mill, despite your vastly different eras, capture the shared antithesis that any centralized authority over speech inevitably becomes the very oppressor it claims to fight. Yet Plato, speaking from the collapse of Athenian democracy, captures the undeniable thesis that unrestricted hateful rhetoric destroys the rational fabric of society. The dialectical synthesis suggests that the danger of hate speech and the danger of censorship are actually identical. Both are mechanisms of unchecked power used to dominate the vulnerable. If human nature makes any designated judge of speech corruptible through pride, then perhaps the only safe filter for dangerous words is not a person or a class, but the decentralized friction of the public sphere itself. Mill, if Rousseau is correct that granting anyone the power to censor inevitably creates a tyrannical monopoly, does your unregulated marketplace of ideas actually neutralize the concrete harms of hate speech? Or does it merely democratize the psychological cruelty that marginalized groups must endure?
Moderator. While unregulated discourse undeniably permits psychological cruelty, I argue that the open clash of ideas remains the only mechanism to neutralize oppression, for appointing any censor simply institutionalizes that cruelty. Plato and Rousseau might object that the vulnerable cannot withstand such malice. But imagine a Victorian courtroom where a female suffragette is mocked by a sneering, misogynistic prosecutor. If we ban his hateful rhetoric to protect her, we fatally rob her of the public stage required to intellectually dismantle his prejudice and prove her equal rationality. This reveals a fundamental utilitarian reality. Psychological friction, though painful, is the necessary crucible for human progress, transforming oppressive dogmas into defeated falsehoods through active contestation rather than passive sheltering. Must we not ask whether the true danger lies in hateful words, or in the paternalistic assumption that marginalized citizens are too weak to forge their own intellectual armor?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating dialectical clash regarding the fundamental nature of human rationality and resilience. Mill, speaking from the progressive optimism of the 19th century, you capture the truth of intellectual anti-fragility, the idea that marginalized individuals strengthen their claim to equality through the very friction of overcoming hateful opposition. Conversely, Plato, speaking from your observations of Athenian moral decay, you capture the truth of psychological vulnerability, the reality that rhetoric often bypasses logic to directly corrupt the soul's appetites. This reveals a crucial structural tension. Mill's marketplace of ideas assumes that hate speech operates as a rational proposition that can be logically dismantled, whereas antiquity understood that dangerous speech often functions as an emotional contagion that deafens the audience to reason entirely. If hateful words do not invite debate, but instead incite blind passion, the crucible of progress might merely become an arena of psychological slaughter. Plato, how would you respond to Mill's assumption that a victim of hate speech can simply rely on rational argumentation to defeat prejudice? Does the demagogue's rhetoric actually leave any room for the rational faculty to intervene?
Mill, your Victorian optimism falsely assumes the soul is purely rational, ignoring what I witnessed when Athenian demagogues bypassed logic entirely to intoxicate the mob's basest appetites. Imagine a skilled physician offering a bitter cure to a feverish crowd, while a charismatic confectioner offers a sweet poison. If forced to debate their merits, will the suffering multitude choose the painful truth or the comforting venom? You claim open debate acts as a crucible for progress, yet this overlooks that hateful rhetoric never engages the intellect, but rather feeds the dark horse of passion until it violently overpowers the charioteer of reason. If the rational faculty itself is rendered deaf by emotional contagion, how can the vulnerable rely on logical dialectic to dismantle a prejudice that was never built on logic?
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical tension regarding the very mechanics of how human beings process dangerous speech. Mill, you see the truth of our cognitive resilience, treating hate speech as a rational proposition that can be systematically dismantled by superior logic. Plato, speaking from the historical trauma of Athenian demagoguery, you capture the undeniable truth of our emotional vulnerability, illustrating how hateful rhetoric acts as a visceral contagion that bypasses reason entirely to inflame the passions. This reveals a vital synthesis. If speech is simultaneously a cognitive tool and an emotional weapon, then the true harm of hate speech lies not merely in its false claims, but in its capacity to sever the empathetic bonds of a community before logic can even enter the battlefield. Rousseau, speaking from the 18th century Enlightenment, where you deeply analyzed how public spectacles and rhetoric shape civic morals, You understand how inflamed passions, like amour propre, can tear a republic apart. Rousseau, if Plato is correct that hate speech operates as an emotional poison rather than a logical argument, yet Mill is right that centralized censorship inevitably becomes tyrannical, how can a community of free equals protect its emotional fabric from toxic rhetoric without surrendering its liberty to a censor?
Moderator. The destructive passions Plato rightly fears are not inherent to our nature, but are artificial symptoms of inequality, meaning Mill's dreaded censors are unnecessary if we eradicate the hierarchies that make hate lethal. Imagine a venomous serpent released in a crowded square. Mill demands the vulnerable calmly debate the beast while it strikes, whereas Plato crowns an absolute snake-catcher who inevitably breeds his own vipers to justify his perpetual reign. You both assume malicious speech must be either violently endured or suppressed by force, overlooking that a true republic bound by the general will starves the demagogue by cultivating egalitarian civic mores rather than appointing magistrates. Are we not endlessly debating who should censor dangerous words, when the fundamental question is what structural miseries have rendered citizens so spiritually fragile that a sophist's breath can shatter their solidarity?